At my father's retirement party, he stood in front of 200 guests, raised his champagne glass, and pointed straight at me. "This is my younger daughter, Cassidy," he announced. "She never finished college, has no real career, and may be the worst investment the Barrett family ever made." The ballroom erupted in laughter. My older sister, Melanie, lowered her head and pretended to sip her champagne, but I could see the smile she was trying to hide. My mother, Patricia, sat at the head table looking embarrassed, not because of what my father had said, but because I was standing there in front of her wealthy friends. What none of them knew was that 30 minutes earlier, I had signed the final papers on a major acquisition. As of that evening, I controlled 63% of the debt tied to my father's company. In other words, most of Barrett Distribution, the company he had spent his entire life bragging about, was already in my hands. I looked at him, lifted my glass, and smiled. "Happy retirement, Richard." I didn't call him Dad. "And enjoy tonight. It may be the last time you stand in this room as the owner of your company." The ballroom went silent. For 2 seconds, my father just stared at me, then he laughed. He thought I was bluffing. I didn't explain myself. I set down my glass, turned around, and walked out of the hotel. A valet opened the door of a black Maybach waiting by the curb. Before I could get inside, I heard heels clicking quickly behind me. Melanie had followed me outside. She looked at the car, then at the tailored suit I was wearing. "Whose car is that?" "Mine." She laughed in my face. "Cassidy, you don't have to pretend with me. Someone who couldn't even finish college does not own a car like this." I didn't answer. My phone buzzed. It was a message from my attorney, Desmond Vance. "The acquisition is complete. We can move forward." I got into the car and left my sister standing outside the hotel. "My name is Cassidy Barrett. I'm 33 years old. For most of my life, I believed that if I worked hard enough, my parents would eventually see me. When I graduated from high school, I was accepted into a good university in Chicago. I didn't expect my parents to pay for everything, so I worked for it myself. I opened a coffee shop at 5 in the morning, then spent my evenings waiting tables at a small restaurant. Every tip, every paycheck, every extra dollar went into an education account my parents managed for me. 2 weeks before classes started, I went to the bank to pay my tuition. There were $87 left in the account. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. When I got home, I learned the truth. My parents had emptied the account to pay for Melanie's wedding. Her dress cost $20,000. The reception had 3,000 white roses, a live orchestra, and enough champagne to fill a swimming pool. Everything I had saved for 4 years had become flowers, music, and expensive photographs for my sister. I asked my father, "What am I supposed to do about college?" He didn't even look at me. "The company is going through a difficult period," he said. "Your sister's wedding affects our family's reputation. Stop being selfish and make a sacrifice." My mother held my hand and added, "Melanie has always been more successful than you. Even with a degree, you probably wouldn't have the kind of future she has." That night, I packed my clothes into 2 trash bags and left. My father didn't stop me. He only said, "When you can't survive on your own, you'll come back." I never went back. The first few years were brutal. I worked night shifts in warehouses and handled shipping orders during the day. I rented a basement room with no windows and slept whenever I could, but while I was working, I noticed something. Most logistics companies were still using outdated systems and manual scheduling. One snowstorm, one broken truck, or one delayed warehouse could disrupt an entire delivery network. So I started teaching myself to code. I couldn't afford a new computer. I bought an old laptop from a secondhand store. It overheated every 2 hours, so I saved my work constantly and prayed it wouldn't die. When I was 23, I built my first logistics forecasting program. Nobody wanted to trust a warehouse worker who had dropped out of college. Nobody except Desmond. Back then, he was a young attorney at a small law firm. I walked into his office with a 6-page business plan and asked him how much it would cost to start a company. He read the whole thing. Then he charged me $1. "I don't know whether this company will succeed," he said, "but I'm willing to bet on the person who created this." That was how Vanguard Logistics AI began. During our first year, we had 3 clients. By our 3rd year, we were profitable. By our 7th, our software was operating across 12 states. 13 years after I left home, more than 400 companies were using our technology. My family knew none of it. I didn't hide my success because I was ashamed. I hid it because I knew exactly what they would do if they found out. They wouldn't celebrate me, they would use me. The morning after the retirement party, my brother-in-law Jamal called. He was Melanie's husband and the chief financial officer of my father's company. His first question was about the Maybach. Who owns that car? I do. Stop lying. Are you seeing some rich older guy? I almost laughed. In Jamal's world, a woman could only have money if it came from her father or from a man. It never crossed his mind that she might have earned it herself. A few minutes later, he revealed why he had really called. He had taken $150,000 from the company. An audit was coming and he needed the money back in the account before anyone noticed. He wanted me to cover it. When I refused, he threatened to tell everyone that my lifestyle was being paid for through an affair with a wealthy man. I quietly turned on the recorder on my phone and let him repeat the threat. Then I said, "You should probably find a lawyer." He laughed. "Are you threatening me?" "No, I'm warning you." After the call, I sent the recording to Desmond. That morning, we began the debt enforcement process. My mother was the first person to notice. She was having lunch at her country club when the server tried 4 different credit cards. Every one of them was declined. At the same time, Barrett Distribution lost access to its operating accounts. Suppliers stopped delivering. Drivers began asking whether they would be paid. 3 warehouses suspended operations. My father called the bank over and over again, but the answer never changed. Most of the company's debt had been purchased by a holding company called Vanguard Holdings. They had no idea Vanguard Holdings belonged to me. 3 days later, I was having dinner with several banking executives at an upscale restaurant. My parents, Melanie and Jamal, happened to be there too. They walked directly to my table. My mother leaned toward me. "Who are you really working for?" Melanie smirked. "Don't tell me you're delivering food here now." People at nearby tables turned to look. For a moment, I felt 19 again. I was back in my parents' living room, holding a bank statement with $87 in the account, waiting for someone to tell me that my future mattered too. Then the chairman of the bank walked over. He held out his hand to me. "Ms. Barrett, it's a pleasure to finally meet you. Vanguard handled this acquisition beautifully." Then he looked at my family. "You must be incredibly proud. She's one of the most impressive business leaders I've ever worked with." My father stopped smiling. Melanie's hand began to shake around her wine glass. My mother looked at me as if she were seeing her daughter for the first time. The next morning, flowers arrived at my office. My father left a message saying he wanted to talk about family. My mother wrote a long text about how much she had missed me. Melanie even sent me an old picture of us as children, but they hadn't suddenly learned to love me. They had learned that I had money. I agreed to attend their so-called reconciliation dinner for the first time in my life. My father pulled out a chair for me. Halfway through dinner, he placed a business proposal on the table. He told me the company was facing a temporary cash flow problem. If I invested $15 million, he would allow me to become executive vice president. He presented it as though he were giving me an opportunity. I looked at him and almost laughed. He had stolen my college savings, dismissed my future, and spent 13 years calling me a failure. Now he wanted me to pay $15 million to purchase a place in my own family. I asked him one question: "If I had no money, would you still have invited me to dinner?" The room became completely silent. My father didn't answer. He didn't need to. I pretended to accept the offer. Desmond prepared the agreement. The first page clearly mentioned the $15 million transfer. My father saw the number and signed immediately. He didn't carefully read the pages that followed. The money wasn't a normal investment. It was part of a debt-to-equity conversion. Once he signed, the debt I controlled would be converted into shares in the company. Several assets used as collateral, including the family home, would also fall under the agreement. 1 week later, my father called a board meeting. He wore his most expensive suit and stood in front of the shareholders with a proud smile. "My daughter has finally decided to return to the family business," he announced. "She will invest $15 million to help us through this difficult period." Everyone applauded. I stood up. "There's one detail you left out." I displayed the agreement on the screen. "This is not a loan, and it is not an unconditional investment. According to the contract you signed, the company's debt has now been converted into equity." The color drained from my father's face. "As of today, I own 72% of Barrett Distribution. You no longer control this company." He rushed toward me. "How dare you do this to your own father?" I looked him directly in the eye. 13 years ago, you taught me that business has no room for family, only contracts." At that moment, the boardroom doors opened. Investigators walked in and arrested Jamal. The evidence of embezzlement, falsified financial records, and attempted blackmail had already been turned over to the authorities. Melanie cried and tried to stop them. My mother kept asking why I was destroying our family, but the most painful moment came when my father finally admitted the truth about my college fund. The company had never been short of money. My parents took my savings because my grades were better than Melanie's. They were afraid that if I attended a better school and became more successful, their favorite daughter would always live in my shadow. So they chose to sacrifice me. In that moment, I didn't feel victorious. I felt empty. For 13 years, I had been trying to prove myself to people who had already decided they didn't want to see my worth. I had built a company, made millions, and taken control of my father's business. On the surface, it looked like revenge. But deep down, I had still been waiting for him to look at me and say, "Cassidy, I was wrong. You were always good enough." That day, I finally understood that some apologies never come. Real freedom isn't forcing the people who hurt you to bow their heads. It's being able to move forward even when they never do. Over the next 6 months, I rebuilt Barrett Distribution. I protected the jobs of the regular employees and paid every dollar of their overdue wages. Melanie lost her executive title, but I didn't throw her out. I moved her into customer service and made her start from the bottom. For the first time in her life, she had to accomplish something without our parents protecting her. My father was assigned to night operations at one of the warehouses. I didn't do it to humiliate him. I wanted him to understand the lives of the workers he had ignored for decades. 1 year later, I received a Businesswoman of the Year award. During the interview, a reporter asked how much my family's support had contributed to my success. I paused before answering. "I never had their support," I said. "But I met people who respected me. Real love isn't choosing someone's future for them. It's standing beside them while they choose it for themselves." After the ceremony, Desmond was waiting for me outside. He had seen me when I was broke, exhausted, and angry. He never pressured me to forgive my family, and he never encouraged me to destroy them. He simply stayed beside me. That night, he handed me a cup of coffee. "The war is over, Cassidy," he said. "Do you think you're ready to try living a normal life?" I smiled and took the cup. "Maybe, but normal life should probably start with dinner." Later, I created an education fund for young women whose families had taken away their opportunities. I couldn't change what happened to me at 19, but I could make sure another 19-year-old girl would never have to stare at an empty bank account and wonder whether she was worthy of love. I used to believe success meant making the people who underestimated me regret it. Now I know real success is reaching a point where you no longer need their regret. Some people bury you because they want you to disappear, but they forget that soil doesn't only cover graves. It also helps seeds grow. And when you finally reach the light, you realize something. You never needed their permission to bloom. You only needed to believe that you were always worthy of the sun.